Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the Demas Rampersad seminar under the Department of Economics at UAE St. Augustine. Warm welcome I extend to you from the department, and it is a pleasure to be here with you all once again at another seminar, Demas Rampersad Discussion Forum. We have had several so far, but I am particularly proud and eager to engage in this session today because we are going to be discussing a topic that is of tremendous and ongoing importance to us here globally and yes, here in the region. And specifically, that is the impact of the pandemic on the Caribbean region in terms of economic and social life. And certainly the impacts are much more than that, but we will be focusing on social impacts. In today's session, we have a panel of 3 distinguished speakers from multilateral agencies working here with us in the region. They're going to spend some time discussing different components of how the pandemic is impacting economic and social life. First up, we have Mr. Dindial Ramrattan, who is a statistician at the Caribbean Development Bank, and he has over 10 years of experience in economics, statistics, and social. Previously, he has spent time at the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, the Ministry of Social Development, and the Chamber of Industry and Commerce here in Trinidad and Tobago. So we welcome Mr. Ramrattan, who will be giving us the views coming from the Caribbean Development Bank. Second speaker, Prof. Abdulkadri, and Prof. Abdulkadri is a coordinator of Statistics and Social Development Unit of UN ECLAC here in the region. Serves in particular as the focal point for ECLAC's achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So certainly somebody we want to hear the views of and representing the UN ECLAC voice here within the region. Our third speaker is Dr. Mooney, and Dr. Mooney comes from the IDB. He's an economic advisor at the Inter-American Development Bank. Previously, he has worked many institutions, multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank and Morgan Stanley in London. He has done work in several countries across the world in Africa, Asia, and Central Asia. And again, in this case, he's bringing the views, his views and that of the Inter-American Development Bank. So we are pleased to have such a distinguished panel on a wide array of interesting topics here. And I'd like to turn over now speakers. But before I do so, let me say that we have these presentations at first where all speakers go, but we want to hear from you all, the audience, in terms of your questions. Of course, the session here is to serve the needs of all those interested in learning more of these topics. And we want to hear your questions. So as you go along, please ask them in the forum. And at the end, coming to the end of the presentations, we will be collecting these questions to your panel. All right. So let me turn over now to Mr. Ramrattan, coming from the Caribbean Development Bank.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Dindial, for the warm welcome, and thanks a lot to everyone for being here. I would like to thank the Department of Economics for granting me this opportunity to, let me just put this on presentation, to share some thoughts on how we can reposition the Caribbean coming out of the COVID-19 crisis. And to my fellow panelists, it is yet again a pleasure to be in your company, and I look forward to our discussions and the possible convergence of ideas to take the region forward. At the Caribbean Development Bank, we recognize the need to rebuild and restructure our economies to enable a strong recovery that is sustainable and inclusive, with benefits equally distributed throughout our respective populations. As I go forward, let me thank Mr. Jaron Boyce for his continued support in making this presentation a reality, and for the modern approaches he brought to sharing findings of various research pieces that we have conducted. Let me begin by taking guard and presenting an assessment of where we are. It is important to note that COVID-19 drastically impacted the region, but many of the issues it exacerbated already existed and will require policy responses, even as economies reopen and some restrictions are lifted. To start, a small open economies, the Caribbean is impacted by global market forces and is highly susceptible to the movements in international markets as key impulses to domestic fiscal, monetary, and real sector policies. COVID-19 produced a recession that was much deeper than the preceding 2008-2009 financial crisis. The high dependence on tourism leading to drastic declines within our region left us comparatively worse off than many of our peers. Conversely, and as we look to recovery, our region is also much slower in erasing some of the negative effects of COVID-19. This is not unlike the empirical evidence after the 2008-2009 crisis, where it took the region on average 4 years to recover losses in real GDP. Thus far, the region is witnessing a rebound in growth levels post-pandemic, but is some ways off returning to real GDP levels as at 2019. As we investigate the real sector impacts, the volatility of commodity prices, particularly oil and natural gas, represents one of the more difficult impulses to prepare for. The recent uptick in international energy market provides a potential growth path for commodity exporters of the region. But over the last 2 years, the uncertainty around trends means windfalls are less consistent, while downturns are less predictable. However, the inflationary pressures of these increases affects levels of disposable incomes and makes it more costly to implement public sector programs, and this can negatively impact manufacturing activity, especially as it relates to intra-regional markets. And speaking of intra-regional markets, these inflationary pressures transcend across economies and predominantly disrupts the potential value added for service exporters. Apart from rising intermediate input costs within the industries, higher energy prices may reduce the propensity to travel in major source markets, as disposable incomes in these country groups may be negatively impacted. COVID-19 highlighted the high vulnerability of the region to international travel. And while tourism may be showing exciting signs of pickup, the vulnerability remains. Hence, we remain tuned to geopolitical tensions and its potential to disrupt said recovery. This leads me to a critical point going forward. We cannot reimagine the Caribbean, reposition the Caribbean, or reinvent the Caribbean without addressing our monocrop nature. The region must reduce its export concentration, which inhibits growth potential and exaggerates downside risk from shock events. The region must improve competitiveness, encourage new industries, and foster intra-regional trade systems to create an ecosystem that is more insulated from extra-regional factors. Together, we can begin a recovery that is driven by cohesive practices that drive shared growth and development. The pandemic had implications for debt. And as a starting point, let's look at the fact that the region started from a protracted period of debt overhang, meaning that debt levels on average exceeded the 60% debt to GDP threshold, above which debt has been found to impact growth negatively. COVID-19 added debt burdens to the region as governments had to balance lower revenues with increased spending on pandemic-induced measures. While prior to the pandemic, economies in the region were generally trending towards debt sustainability, in 2020, there was a sharp reversal with this trend as governments undertook measures to protect lives and livelihoods within the region. This occurred through two transmission mechanisms. One, an increase in borrowing, which affected the debt numerator ratio, and two, lockdown and border closures, which ultimately led to a decline in GDP, which impacted on the denominator of the accounting identity. Early signs in 2021 and thus far in 2022 shows that the initial rebound in growth towards recovery helped ease some of these debt concerns. However, the region is left worse off than pre-crisis levels and has some ground to make up. This brings us to today. CDB estimates a strong uptick in growth in 2022, albeit buffered by the ongoing geopolitical tensions and resulting impacts on global energy and commodity markets. With persistently high rates of inflation driven by supply shortages in the second half of 2021, and now the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the region is facing a trade impasse with rising prices expected to negatively affect merchandise trade balances throughout much of the region. And here, let's focus on this intra-regional trade line, which is just a fraction of our total trade. And this provides an opportunity for us to look to a stronger partnership going forward. And a critical concern actually of this current spiral is the fact that the region operates largely as a net fuel and food importer, with dependence on imported sources of these items growing significantly over the last 20 years. As prices continue to increase, the value of these imports, where they can be accessed, will further increase as a share of total imports. And why do I say where they can be accessed? As we saw during the latter part of last year, the Caribbean is not only at risk of increased foreign exchange demand to satisfy these basic needs, but also runs the risk of not being able to access some items in times of global market tightening. We need to refocus on satisfying many of these items through domestic and regional sources to help ease the uncertainty around access. Sharper and more long-term international shocks will be more destabilizing to our economies if we do not build production resilience to better provide for our populations. So what does this tell us in terms of repositioning the region? The immediate response of the COVID pandemic was to protect lives, livelihood, and social cohesion. Now economies have reopened. Exports are improving and labor markets are rebalancing. Countries have to look at the key to sustainable recovery as rebooting existing export industries while diversifying our earnings potential into new markets and products. Achieving this requires improved competitiveness and structural improvements that supplements increased private sector participation in the recovery. This amounts to increasing productivity and reducing costs to allow exporters to compete in export sectors that are not dependent solely on natural endowments like tourism and primary products. At this point, I must mention the Muscovado bias in this discussion. We need to engage in higher value-added production. And in doing so, there's a role for both governments, industry, in this repositioning of the region. Partnerships, innovation, research and development, and the adoption of modern technologies to amplify this productive capacity is required. Achieving these gains requires a sustainable and supportive policy environment that adopts proactive measures and efficiently conducts monetary and fiscal promotion policies in the promotion of inclusive and sustainable actions. Monetary and fiscal policies must intertwine and remain interconnected, aimed at achieving the same objectives and built on strong regulation and enforcement. Furthermore, it is important that the region engages the SDGs as a critical part of national development planning. The SDGs provides a framework to achieve significant gains through the people, planet, and prosperity of our region. Climate change, inequality of access, and the protection of our poor and vulnerable populations must become part of our economic, social, and environmental resilience as we trod on this path towards sustainable and inclusive growth and development. To achieve this, we need to review our chart of accounts and localize classification of expenditures so that we can produce key performance indicators that allows us to measure success and compare to other economies, both like emerging, developed, in achieving the goals of the 2030 agenda. But we also need to monitor and evaluate initiatives and the benefits to stakeholders to ensure that our limited fiscal space is being used in the most efficient and responsive manner. In this regard, and to examine how we can revisit existing issues within the overall perspective of sustainability, let us look at one topic under the SDG umbrella: to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, SDG Goal 7. And let us now look at the electrification of the region. Whether under the Blue Economy umbrella or a sustainable energy focus, the benefits of marine renewable energy stands out as an emerging area that can help the region to, 1, become more energy resilient, 2, become more productively resilient, and 3, provide for the social fabric of our populations by allowing for greater dependence on ourselves and possibly in the long term cheaper electrification. Throughout the region, there exists a potential to produce significant energy resources that exceeds existing demand. And this is something we need to think about. If we could produce more than we need, we could then, and it then becomes cheaper for access, it could actually encourage new growth streams, but through one of the basic tenets of, one of the basic factors of production we have to consider, which is electrification. In the long run, such investments can reduce our demand for foreign exchange to import fuels for business activities. It can increase our resilience as we are less dependent and less vulnerable to the impacts of international prices and availability of a key raw material. And this can eventually lower electrification costs, which is often cited as a key impediment to doing business in the region. And these benefits are not restricted to service exporting economies. Even as a mature player in the energy market, Trinidad and Tobago can reap massive returns from such investments for a country that currently provides electricity, through a pricing structure that leads to a potential loss of earnings. And the key word here is potential, right? Because if natural gas were to be diverted to higher value customers and electricity were to be provided from marine renewable sources, what we also have is a case where the net earnings potential for the energy industry grows significantly because we're using the natural gas resources where it gets greater returns and we are providing electricity from a renewable source. This also helps us as we move towards achieving our nationally determined contributions and becoming a more sustainable, environmentally friendly economy. In saying all this that I said today, I hope this was useful. CDB has built its support to the region around 5 pillars of resilience: production resilience, financial resilience, institutional resilience, social resilience, and environmental resilience. What I hope we can take away is that national development planning, CDB development planning, and the SDGs can all be intertwined as we look at the classification and how we treat with these activities. This overarching theme needs to be driven by innovation and good governance and must address issues of regional cooperation. Throughout, as I spoke about the ways to reposition our economies, it has been stated we need to reposition together. We could do this faster, better, and stronger together. And we create an ecosystem where we drive growth and innovation as one region. Doing this, though, needs to also focus on an overworked and under-resourced input statistics. We need to measure better to target better. We need to ensure that evidence-based decision-making is a natural process with data and statistics readily available to inform policies, strategies, and activities. Knowledge creation, knowledge accumulation, and statistics for policy formulation is critical, as this provides suitable metrics to monitor and evaluate policies and address shortcomings to help the region continuously improve. Agility in policy requires suitably resourced and suitably entrenched statistical environment that supports our repositioned region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dindial, for that very interesting presentation. And I want to encourage the audience members to keep those questions coming for Mr. Ramrattan, as well as our upcoming speakers. Next up, we have Prof. Abdulkadri from ECLAC, and let me turn over the forum to him now. Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dindial, for the invitation and the introduction. Let me put. Okay. I'm really glad to be part of this panel discussing this critical issue of COVID-19 and its impact on the community. We'll be focusing on the socioeconomic impact and glad that Dindial has laid a very good foundation for me to build upon. So I won't be spending time talking about the very obvious issues of economic impact of COVID-19. So to start with, let me touch a little bit as Dindial did to look at the existing or pre-existing vulnerabilities. There are some socio-economic vulnerabilities that the Caribbean was experiencing before COVID-19. And that COVID-19 started essentially as a health shock and then resulted in a more global issue of economic, social, and even environmental concern. So prior to COVID-19, the Caribbean is still one of the regions, sub-regions of the world with a very high prevalence of non-communicable diseases. And what we have seen is that NCD tends to be one of the conditions that make COVID-19 impact to be severe or to actually increase the probability of dying from COVID-19. And on top of that, the high cost of out-of-pocket health expenditure in the Caribbean is one of the issues that make the quality and access to healthcare to be a challenge. So we're coming from an environment in which there are some health challenges before COVID-19 happened. And then there is also the issue of poverty. Poverty and inequalities are quite high in the Caribbean, more than we will tend to believe. And inequality in particular, because there are quite a few Caribbean countries that are high income countries, which that's another issue that we can speak about, being high income, but with a number of vulnerabilities. We tend to focus on the environmental vulnerabilities and the susceptibility to high debt, as Dindial mentioned. But there is also the vulnerability of high inequality. And what that does is in countries that have high income, that may mirror the significance of poverty. Because what you have is that you may have some people that are indigent. And because in general, when you look at the average or the median income, the impression is that there will be no concern for poverty.
Prof, any chance you can increase, put it on full screen, please?
Are you seeing it in full screen?
No, we're not. Perhaps start from the beginning on the top left.
Yeah. Okay. Let me try this again. Sorry about that.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. My apologies. Is it coming out fine?
Yes, we're reading you loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Yes. So as I was saying, we have this issue of health, the issue of poverty, and also when we look at the education sector, there are concerns about declining quality of education and the skill set that school leavers come out with. And that is apparent when you talk to the employers of labor. And that leads us to the issue of the labor market, where we have a declining labor productivity and the high unemployment rate among especially women and young persons. And also the issue of violence, where violence against women and girls in particular was on the rise in the region in general. So we have all these pre-existing vulnerabilities. And then came COVID-19. And with COVID-19, and as I said earlier on, with the issue of the NCD, so these are some of the risk factors where we have and this is also an indication which COVID alluded, which Dindial alluded to about data, which I will talk also about if the time permits. But here we have some figures, a little dated, but showing some of the risk factors of NCDs. So, and then we have COVID, which essentially shut down the economy and prevented people from being active, which increases the risk. For example, physical activity will be reduced. There are indications that people started to drink more and other unhealthy habits. So, and with the issue of unemployment and poverty, so we see here that poverty is actually not as low as we might assume across many Caribbean countries. And when you look at the unemployment rates, especially youth unemployment, we have youth unemployment being as high as 40% or above 40% in a number of countries prior to COVID. And the issue of labor productivity that I mentioned earlier on, if we look at the original comparison, and in comparison, lower middle income and upper middle income, the Caribbean wasn't doing well. And when other sub-regions or other groupings, country groupings were actually increasing their labor productivity, what we noticed in the Caribbean was a decline in labor productivity, which is quite concerning. And that becomes even more interesting, ironic, a choice of word. But looking at 3 Caribbean countries for which we have data, which are coming from the Global Competitiveness Report, for 2019. So what we see is when you look at the skill sets of the current workforce and of the future workforce, you see quite an alarming gap, where there's this is the ranking among 141 countries that were ranked. And you see the gap between the current workforce and the future workforce, which shows that even though we are having challenges with labor productivity today, the situation is going to be even it's going to be worse in the future because of the skill sets of the future workforce. Now with COVID. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Any chance you can advance the slides? Only seeing the first slide. Okay, thank you.
So going to the impact of COVID that we are seeing with respect to the socioeconomic sector, we have crises in which persons that have health needs have suspended care, either due to the fear of contracting COVID if they go to the hospital or if they visit the doctor's office, or because of prioritization of care, where if you are not an emergency case, then you are advised to postpone care. And if we go back to the issue of those with NCDs, these are chronic diseases that need to be managed. So suspending care will worsen the situation. And now that we're returning back to normal, there's a possibility that we might see a spike in those who are suffering from NCDs. And that also is related to the increase in unhealthy behaviors, like I mentioned earlier on, where people consume alcohol in order to cope with the restriction of social interaction, the social distancing restrictions that were imposed in order to manage COVID-19 infections. And people eating unhealthy diets and so on and so forth because of the fact that they have to make ends meet. So these are things that will aggravate health situations of persons, especially NCDs. And we also notice that there's a very high prevalence of childhood obesity in the Caribbean. And that has an impact on the productivity of the future labor force. And with respect to poverty, more households have been driven into poverty because, of course, when persons have lost their jobs, the heads of household are unemployed. employed or they've had their working hours significantly reduced. That will have an impact on their spending, on their disposable income and their quality of life. And what we have observed, particularly with COVID-19, is that those households or persons that traditionally will not be vulnerable became vulnerable because of the shutdown of the economy. I've always made this example of airline pilots. If you are a pilot or work in the airline industry, the last thing you will expect is for you to be poor. But essentially, they had no jobs. And if they are lucky, their employers are kept paying them, but that may not be the case for every one of them. And you can think of so many other professionals like that. And they have obligations, probably mortgages, and so on and so forth. So more households have been driven into poverty or at the risk of falling into poverty if nothing drastic happens to support them. With respect to the labor market, for service economies in particular, we know that those economies are dominated by women. And the service economy, and I know there will be a presentation later on tourism, where we have a high proportion percentage of women employed in the tourism sector. Tourism was pretty much on hold during COVID-19 and post-COVID-19. If we call the recovery period or as COVID-19 period. So what that meant is that more women and women-headed households are at a much greater disadvantage when it comes to their ability to earn income. And added to that is the increased burden of unpaid care work, where women and girls traditionally have the traditional role of being caregivers. And also in areas where they actually work in healthcare, caregiving where it's paid, you have, that's an area that COVID-19 was significantly affected. And then you have women bearing a greater burden when it comes to this. And also the greater erosion of decent jobs, where you may have a good job before. I mentioned the case of the airline pilots, and suddenly, because the economy was shut down, many people working in the restaurant industry, servicing industry in general, was very adversely impacted. And we're not sure how many of these jobs will come back and the quality of the jobs that will come back, because what you will have, what will result from that will be underemployment, where people have jobs, but they are not necessarily fully engaged or fully employed, and they have to accept it because that is better than not being employed. Then the issue of education in the education sector, we know what happened with schools being shut down and learning transferred to online platforms. And then those who are either from poor households or from remote households had very significant challenges in accessing education. We've had cases in which a household may have, 3, 4, 5 children going to school, but maybe they don't have a laptop and they might have to share the one smartphone that is available in the family to do their homework and to access their educational materials. So what that does is to further put the quality gaps in those who have and those that do not have. And then that may not show right now, but again, in the next few years, we'll start seeing those gaps created by COVID-19 circumstances where online instructions have had to be made. And then the violence against women and girls. We've had increasing cases of report of violence against women and girls during COVID-19. So these are significant issues that we have to deal with in the area of socioeconomic impact. And we have seen these through different surveys that have been done through different analyses. But what we do not have is credible, or I shouldn't say credible, what we do not have are official statistics yet. And because many countries postpone their censuses and the surveys of living conditions, or many surveys that will allow us to really have figures or have statistics on the impact of COVID-19. Official statistics are not there yet. But we do have so many surveys that have been done, which tend to reflect the perception of persons and households. Now, so we also have information on the kind of response that governments have invested in, or the kind of response that they have given to COVID-19 in terms of social protection, which is quite interesting. And we did an analysis at ECLAC, which as of 2021, I think, gave an estimated total of about 1.4 billion US dollars that Caribbean governments have actually invested in social protection measures. Now, so given all this that we know, what are some of the ways in which we can move on? We can move towards a more resilient recovery from COVID-19 impact. Like I said, poverty, we need to put a greater effort in reducing poverty, eradicating poverty if that's possible. But if not possible in the short term, we have to do as much as we can to reduce poverty. And I'm talking in terms of government, civil society, employers of labor, to try and make whatever contribution that they can make to eradicate poverty through social protection. And we can talk at length about what kind of social protections are there, but these measures have been noted to have a very good positive impact in eliminating, making households, preventing households from falling into indigence, and for allowing households to grow out of poverty and to prevent intergenerational poverty. Health and well-being of population is critical to productive economy. What we've noticed also is that generally in the Caribbean, the recommended investment, public expenditure on health, is below the recommended level of 6% of GDP. Now that we have COVID-19, which is essentially a health shock, there needs to be further investment in health to ensure that people get adequate care, and to also improve public health measures, inclusive, accessible, and quality education. We're talking about making education more accessible, but we also have to put emphasis on the quality of instruction that students are getting, not only for them to be literate and numerate, to gain literacy and numeracy, but for them to have what we call functional skills, which will help them in the labor market, and for them to be creative and innovative, gender equality and empowerment. It's been that there are studies that have shown that when you empower the women in the household, the quality of life, the standard of living of the children actually improves. And so if we're talking about addressing some of the socioeconomic fallout of COVID-19, then we need to pay greater emphasis on women and girls, to let them be economically empowered, to enhance their ability to generate income, which will enhance the socioeconomic status of their households and family. Innovation and creativity. This is related to the issue I said about quality education. Our education sector needs to focus more on developing that all-round labor market, all-round experts, which will provide a kind of productivity increase that the Caribbean badly needs. And the shock, which is the COVID-19, provides an opportunity for building more resilient economies. And as my colleague, co-panelist mentioned earlier on about the SDGs, this provides an opportunity for us to look at the 17 SDGs and see ways in which we can address some of the socioeconomic impact that COVID has caused, and to allow us to advance in attaining those global goals. Thank you very much, and I yield to you.
Thank you, Prof. Abdulkadri. Been sharing with us the pandemic and how it our economies have been, the experience within economies in terms of people and households, and certainly a very important perspective here. Before I turn over to the next speaker, Prof, I'm going to ask you to, if you, some audience members may have experienced difficulties with the audio level, and maybe it might be good if we restart your device while the next presentation is going on. Hopefully that clears it up. But thank you, Prof, and we will come back to, I'm sure we have questions. Let me turn over at this time to our third panelist and final member of the panel today, Dr. Mooney, who comes in from the Inter-American Development Bank. Dr. Mooney, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. If you can't, please let me know. I'm about to share my screen. Yes. Great. So thanks very much, Dr. Dindial and other panelists. It's an honor to be here today on behalf of myself and the Inter-American Development Bank. This is an important topic, and obviously one for anyone working on the Caribbean that has occupied most of our time and our energy for the last couple of years. So I have been asked specifically today to focus on the shock, particularly the tourism sector, and how that particular sector fared during the crisis and why that generated such a deep shock to the region. Given that I have about 15 minutes, I'll try and keep to that time, and I will probably skip over a couple of slides for that reason. But I think, before we talk specifically about 2020 and 2021, it's important to, to look back a little bit prior to the crisis to understand a little bit better, how the Caribbean was performing as a group of economies relative to the rest of the world coming into the crisis, because I think that context is very important. And what I will say, what you see on the screen is drawn from recent publications of ours at the IDB, several of them focused on the crisis, as well as sort of how to emerge from the crisis and future growth opportunities. What you see on the screen are broken down averages of real GDP growth for some of the Caribbean countries, the ones that we focus on in my particular department: Bahamas, Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago, broken down by decade. So these are average growth rates over the course of the decades you see. And what's very apparent without looking very closely at the numbers is that those bars in yellow, which are the Caribbean economies, have experienced extreme volatility over the decades in terms of growth performance. In some decades, over the entire decade, the average growth was negative for some countries, or certainly very marginal at best. Now, when you compare that to the blue bars, which are some comparators that we thought relevant: high, middle income, and low income economies, as well as small states, what you can see is that in relative terms, many of our countries have lagged behind. Now, what you see on the screen is the decade immediately preceding the crisis, so the 2010s. And again, that story is consistent with what we had seen in history: extreme volatility, performance differentiated across the countries in many respects based on production structure. Now, as I'm sure you all recall, the 2010s were an era of a commodity boom, at least part of it. So countries that were commodity exporters and producers tended to fare better. But of course, that's also a volatile market. Now, before we go on, I'm talking about tourism, but there is a narrative that in our research that's very important, and that I will come back to again later. One of the reasons for this extreme volatility, in addition to the natural vulnerabilities of the region, which of course include the small size of our economies, their dependence on external demand, particularly from advanced economies, but even from each other, as well as susceptibility to things like natural disasters and other crises, have meant that this growth performance has been susceptible to extreme volatility. But one of the factors that we try to look through in our research, the IDB is focused on trying to help our countries develop and grow faster and in a more inclusive way. Total factor productivity, or productivity in general, has been one of the key themes, right? At the end of the day, if you strip away many of the other factors, low and declining levels of productivity are one of the key reasons why our region has been held back. What you see on the screen is a long-term time series for productivity, TFP in particular for Barbados, Jamaica, and Trinidad. It's a comparable data set, which is why we're showing this compared to the 1970 level, which is the red dotted line. And what you can see very clearly is that levels have declined relative to even the 1970 level. But the story is reasonably consistent across the region, looking at different data. So on to the topic at hand, 2020. I just showed you sort of the prologue. But 2020 was, I mean, for lack of a better term, a horrific year for countries all across Latin America and the Caribbean, including our countries in particular. So here on the screen is a very simple measure. We look back in time and tried to find the worst shock year on year, single year shock that we could find up to 2019, including 2019. And that is the blue bar for countries all across the region. And the yellow bar is 2020, so the year in which COVID had its most severe impact. And what you can see is that for many countries in the region, 2020 was the worst single year shock anyone had ever seen, including double-digit contractions of real GDP in many countries across the region, right? So just to punctuate a history of volatile performance and lagging productivity growth, 2020 was an extremely difficult year. Now, the question is why? I mean, I think intuitively we all know it was an extreme event. It had implications for all sorts of sectors. But in the case of tourism in particular, but it's also true for commodity exporters, our countries are exporters. If you look at a production function, right, a growth accounting breakdown of output, why, right? Consumption, investment, and net trade, right? Net exports. Of course, in the case of this shock, the shock came through this export channel, X, right? So even though consumption and investment contracted as well, the major shock was to exports, and that is what drove that contraction in growth. Now, tourism. We all knew our region was heavily tourism focused and tourism dependent. We at the IDB had been thinking about this dependence and what that meant in terms of both vulnerabilities and opportunities for a long time. We developed something called the Tourism Dependency Index during the crisis to try and map out that vulnerability and focus on countries that we thought were going to be most effective. Now, our index, which we update every year now, the latest version that we are publishing is the one in front of you. And we use the components of this index are the contribution of tourism to GDP, to employment, and to exports. We're using averages. So when we put this together, what you see on the screen is very telling, right? So of the world's most tourism-dependent economies, many of them are in the Caribbean. Aruba is plus or minus the world's most tourism-dependent economy based on our index, but other countries like the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Barbados, and Jamaica are in the top 10. In terms of tourism dependence relative to all other countries in the world. And we created this index for 175 countries globally. Now, what does that mean? Just to try and put it to you graphically, this is all those 175 countries for which we've developed this index and calculated this index in terms of tourism dependence. And the legend, the scale is there on the left. The more red on the scale means more tourism dependent, the more green means less tourism dependent. Now that's the entire world, and I know it's hard to see the Caribbean there for the entire global map. But when we zoom in on the Caribbean, I think it puts it in perspective, right? As I was saying before, Caribbean countries are by and far the world's most tourism dependent economies, which is exactly why the shock was so devastating to our countries. Now, part of some of the research we did was looking back in time, trying to think about, certainly early on in the crisis, how deep the crisis could be depending on the shock to tourism. And we tried to identify previous shocks to the tourism sector to give us a sense of how big the magnitude would be. Well, when we did that, the largest shock we could find, at least in the last 20 years for which comparable data was available, was the global economic crisis, 2008, 2009. Year-on-year shock there to the tourism trade to our region was about 4%, a 4% decline. In the end, COVID drove about a 73% decline, right? So that's the bar to the right. And I think that puts in perspective how deep the shock was. Now, when we were thinking about the shock and how bad it could be, we were thinking about not only, employment and growth, but we were also thinking about other macro issues like exchange rates and the balance of payments. So one of the things that one of the measures, when we were doing our own projections internally, for example, going back to that equation I showed you before of the shock to the balance of payments or the net exports, one thing that really, really concerned us at the outset was the shock to the balance of payments. Now, graphically, what you see on the screen is our country's current account balance ranked against tourism receipts in percentage terms of GDP. So the blue is the current account balance, in the year prior to the crisis, and the orange is tourism receipts in an average year running up to the crisis. And what you can see there is quite striking. That tourism receipts, which of course show up as exports in the balance of payments, it's foreign currency revenue, in almost every case, it was considerably larger than the net balance of the current account. Now, for economists out there, and I guess most of you are economists, you understand through Mundell-Fleming, among other relationships, that a shock to the balance of payments and a shock to exports should result in a shock to the exchange rate, whether real, or in expectations terms. So this was one of the concerns that we had going into the crisis, that the shock would be massive on the export side and would have an impact on the exchange rate. Now, there are very few silver linings to this crisis, but one of the silver linings, and I think it's worth highlighting here with the example of Jamaica, is that actually it was not quite as bad as we thought in net export terms and in balance of payments terms. Why is that? Even though the shock was significant, and I'm showing here Jamaica's balance of payments, but it was actually a story that repeated itself across much of the region. Exports fell by a lot, particularly tourism exports, but also commodity exports. But one of the things we knew but couldn't quantify going into the crisis was that tourism sector is actually very import dependent. So even though exports of tourism in the balance of payments terms fell, imports also fell. Now, imports are things like, for the hotels, import food, import material, capital goods, import services, import power, used power, which is based on often commodities like hydrocarbon imports. So what we saw was a very large contraction, sort of offsetting contraction of imports is when exports went down. The other thing we saw was that remittances went up. In the case of Jamaica, remittances went up considerably by about 6 percentage points of GDP. In 2020. Now, those remittances, as you know, are funds sent back from people abroad, working and living abroad, back to the region. And that those two factors, the import compression and remittances, actually helped to offset the shock to exports, and meant that actually in the case of Jamaica, the current account improved in 2020, despite the shock to exports. So this is one of the few silver linings from the crisis. Even though the growth shock was severe, it could have been worse if not for this compression of imports and remittances. Now, looking forward, what do we expect? 2020 was certainly the worst of it. We hope that it doesn't get any worse than that in the future, although no one really knows given how this virus has evolved. But I think the odds are that things are going to get better. In one of our publications in May of 2021, which focused on tourism and tourism recovery and the kinds of policies, for example, countries needed to put in place, we focused on a survey of private sector tourism experts and asked them at that time, again, it was early 2021, and we got responses about what they thought would be the timeline for a full recovery of the tourism sector. So what you see on the screen, again, is from one of our publications, reflects what the percentage of these experts that responded to these surveys. About 1% of them at that time said that the tourism sector would recover fully to 2019 levels by the end of 2021. 15% said by the end of 2022, and a mix of about 40% each said 2023 or 2024 or later. So on that basis, all of the expectations, ours, countries themselves, the IMF's own projections, for example, all sort of estimated a recovery timeline of 2023 or 2024 for countries across the world. Now, another silver lining is that even though the shock was probably most pronounced for Caribbean countries, it is looking like based on early data, it is looking like Caribbean countries are recovering faster than many around the world, right? So what you see on the screen, this is again from a recent publication of ours, is actual data Q3 on Q3, so year on year at the end to the end of Q3. Tourism data. So we compared 2019 levels to 2020 levels. As I said before, it was about a 70% compression. And then the data we had available for Q3 of 2021 suggests that actually there was quite a recovery, right? It was up to about 77% of the 2019 levels for Caribbean countries. Now, globally, the numbers are much worse. In fact, globally, tourism hasn't gotten to, at least at this time, had not even gotten to about 50%. So what does that say? I mean, I think this is the result of a few phenomena that we are hypothesizing or having some evidence of. And that is that, the tourism sector's demand patterns have changed. So people are, particularly from the United States and Canada, are preferring to stay closer to home. Instead of going on transatlantic flights to Europe or to Asia or wherever, they're preferring to do travel that is closer to home, which certainly includes the Caribbean. So shorter flights and destinations that perhaps they can get home from more quickly. So I think that is, at least until now, proving to be a benefit for the region. So I am running out of time. I did have a few slides on potential areas where we think coming out of the crisis investment could be focused beyond the tourism sector. One of them is digital infrastructure, but given the time that we have, I think I'm going to leave it there and say thank you very much. I'm happy to share this presentation afterwards with links to the publications that we're referring to, and otherwise very looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Mooney, for sharing the tourism perspective, and you've certainly given us some food for thought there. We appreciate the context before, during, and of what has happened globally. So thank you to you and all presenters so far. I would like now, and in this session, we're going to turn to the question and answer component, and our audience members have been listening in keenly. We do have some questions here, and before I get excited my own questions, let me start with questions from the audience. First up, we have a question here to Dr. Abdulkadri concerning tourism, and the question is originally posed to Dr. Abdulkadri, but I'll also ask Dr. Mooney if he has any comments, can certainly respond to this. And the question is this: Barbados's economy took the route to diversify the economy through tourism even before the pandemic hit. Do you think it would be a viable option for other Caribbean countries who do not, or who have not built in a tourism attraction already established, to focus in on tourism? Do you think the funds would be better spent rebuilding other sectors like healthcare sector at this time, or should there still be that emphasis on tourism as a means of diversifying economies? Dr. Abdulkadri.
Yeah, thank you, Regan. And I think Dr. Mooney is probably a better place to answer, but let me just provide one or two general thoughts. Anytime we talk about diversification of the economy, it's always a good thing, especially when you have an economy that is very heavily dependent on one or two sectors, which is the case with Barbados. So the diversification away from tourism, it's always a good situation. But in that diversification, what we need to take into consideration is the comparative advantage, areas in which the country has comparative advantage or build that competence. And you also have to be sensitive to the global market. You know, what is the trend? If you want to develop or you want to diversify your economy, you don't diversify into a sector in which the data suggests that the world is moving away from. So, and what we've learned from COVID-19 is that there's going to be a high return to competency. And so this may be related to another issue that I mentioned in my presentation, where prior to COVID-19, it was unheard of for you to have a job and just stay at home and say, I'm working from home. It will look like you yourself might even feel like, maybe that's not the job. But COVID-19 has forced many economies, many companies, many government offices to allow persons to work from home. And there are companies that are actually seeing productivity gain from that, although it may be a short-term productivity gain. And what that indicates is that in the future, once you are quite competent, it doesn't matter whether you're in Barbados or Trinidad, you may work in China and get handsomely paid, but you have to develop that competence and develop that competence in the skills area where such global marketability or the global market will exist for your skills. So when we talk about diversification, not only in Barbados, it's relevant to Trinidad and Tobago and a number of Caribbean countries. So it is good that COVID-19 is forcing countries to think about diversifying, and in the case of Barbados, that they started pre-COVID-19, I think they should continue, but in diversifying, that should be focused on where do we diversify to so that we can get maximum from it. Back to you.
Thank you. Dr. Mooney, any comments here?
No, I fully agree. In terms of, we have always known, long known that countries in this region and many others, could benefit from diversification, right? So forget COVID. A diversified economy means that you have multiple sources of income. It means that you're not so connected to one particular cycle of another country that you may be very dependent on, that you have diversified sources of foreign exchange income. There's all kinds of fantastic benefits from diversification. So we've always known that. I mean, the trouble has always been that it's not an easy thing to do, right? And beyond that, we were talking about tourism. Obviously, we know the countries that have found natural resources have done extremely well. That's a blessing in its way. It can be a curse as well. But tourism-dependent economies should also consider themselves blessed. There is something that, you're not exporting crude oil, you're exporting sun and sand, but this is an extremely valuable commodity that you have. I think what this crisis is letting us think is forcing us to think about is sustainability of that product, even diversification of that product itself. So trying to find new markets and different kinds of segments of markets, and that will be important going forward. But I think thinking beyond just the tourism sector, as my co-panelist was just saying, I think the crisis has also presented new opportunities, right? I'll give you an example. In Jamaica, a country that I've worked on closely for some time, they have done extremely well with the business process outsourcing sector, right? So a sector, Jamaicans working with and for global companies. It started with call centers, but now they're doing much higher value added services like legal services, medical advisory services, engineering, technical services. And that is something, as was mentioned, that is going to be easier to do and more common because everything is virtual now, right? And that has been pushed forward considerably. And it's also an area where this region has a comparative advantage. Same time zone as the United States, Canada, very large markets, same language. So you have a linguistic advantage. The challenge is now to make sure that you have the kind of connectivity and skills required to take advantage of that. But I think there are lots of opportunities that are emerging, and it's an important conversation to continue.
We have some more questions. There seem to be in the tourism sector, and these are coming from members of the audience. So let me ask the next question we have, and it is addressed to Dr. Mooney. Should tourism-dependent Caribbean governments implement inflation mitigants, such as what has recently happened in Barbados? And if so, what specific measures would you suggest?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely familiar with what's recently happened in Barbados as a reference. But yes, I mean, I think one of the interesting sort of second order effects of this crisis is this, this globalized inflation phenomenon that we're all seeing, right? I mean, and it's complicated policy making all across the region, I can tell you. We work with these governments very closely, and central banks and governments themselves, all of whom are struggling with how to deal with supply chain bottlenecks, rising commodity prices, and other pass-through inflation factors that are affecting economies all across the region, and at a really unfortunate time, right? Most of our economies are still suffering from this growth contraction, growth impact, and the fact that policies are having to be tightened, for example, monetary policies in this recovery is actually an unfortunate thing. So yes, to the extent that governments and central banks can work together to try and address this rising inflation, but without doing so in a way that blunts the recovery, right? I mean, I think that's for me at a high level, that's the most important thing, right? It's a complex policy environment. It's not exactly stagflation of the 1970s, but it's let's call it recoveryflation or something, where you have these external factors causing inflation. You have very few policy levers that can operate effectively domestically, but you do have to respond to these inflationary pressures. So being creative in terms of the kinds of policies, whether it's tax breaks on the fiscal side for some of the, the low elasticity commodities like, hydrocarbons, but in a way that targets those who need it. I think those are smart policies, and also thinking through the cycle, right? Again, having myself once worked for a central bank, monetary policy operates with long and variable lags. It takes 18 months sometimes for that policy rate increase to affect the economy. And when you're thinking about these transitory factors, perhaps transitory factors, you have to think very hard about what and how to use those levers. But it's a complex environment. So I would agree that smart policies to combat inflation in the short term can be very helpful.
Are there any initiatives on the side of the IDB in terms of, and this is coming from the audience as well, in terms of supporting tourism-dependent countries? And is it possible, if there are, can you share some of that support measures that you've implemented or embarking upon?
Yes, so I can tell you that the IDB, it prides itself on being the partner of choice and the preferred partner for all countries in the Americas with whom we work. I think it is true for all of our countries. We are the largest development partner in every respect for countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. The IDB had its record year in 2020 in terms of the support that we were able to deploy, financial and otherwise, to the region. So we're working on many fronts, everything from providing direct financial support, budget support to governments, especially in the Caribbean. I've been involved myself in a number of emergency loans. In fact, we revamped our toolkit of lending instruments to make it faster dispersing and less conditional in the case of the crisis. We're also working on trying to provide direct support measures in many of the social areas that were mentioned, providing health support to the healthcare sectors, education sectors, and other social sectors that were badly affected, the most vulnerable groups. And we are now focusing, as we're exiting the crisis, trying to focus more on the private sector, right? So the private sector was very badly affected in every country. So we are trying to deliver more financing and support, whether it's direct financing or guarantees or technical support to medium and small enterprises, for example, to try and help them not just stay afloat, but to help them grow. So we as an institution, we're focusing on all fronts, and we are delivering more support than ever before.
Let me ask the same question. Thanks, Dr. Mooney, to Mr. Ramrattan. Dindial, the Perspective Development Bank, and how have you all treated with support measures? What have you all been can you share some of the measures you've embarked upon in terms of supporting countries? Certainly, the entire region would have felt the effect, and I'm expanding the question here to beyond just tourism countries. But can you share with us, Dindial, some of the measures that you all may be involved in?
Yeah, surely. I mean, immediately at the onset of the crisis, we would have reposition some of our lending and our payments in a form that ease some of the fiscal burden for countries by shifting downwards some repayments and loans that at least give some space to engage in direct response measures. Also, we did partner a lot along both the provision of PPEs, and then eventually we have an arrangement for vaccines where we try to ensure we reach the lives and livelihoods of some of the key poor and vulnerable communities and helped in the response measures. What I'd like to point out is that CDB is a major part of its mission is poverty reduction and assisting poor and vulnerable communities. So we would have always kept focus with that mission and tried to reach as far as possible. Other initiatives included in areas of creative industries. One of the industries that would have been heavily affected by the pandemic. We had response measures fitted in there, as well as small and micro enterprises. As Dr. Mooney would have mentioned, I mean, this was a regional response. So it wasn't tied to just CDB initiatives. We would have partnered a lot with other development banks. So it wouldn't have only been CDB-led, it could have been CDB supported. And we viewed this part of the response as critical, partnering to get the widest reach. As we go forward now, it becomes helping our economies not respond, but reposition. And we would now be looking at areas that in the diversification quest, we could help, we have our natural package of measures that we use, whether it's PBLs, whether it's operational loans on ports, infrastructure, on achieving basic needs and services. So we will continue in this line. So while they may not have had the COVID response tagline throughout, what we've been focused on is response, reposition, and reform our economies to make us stronger and rebuild better.
Okay. You know, one of the themes we hear coming out of all these presentations, and certainly a reflection of what we know within the field of economics and social work, is that the pandemic and the problems that we're experiencing here are not because necessarily of the pandemic before. These are challenges within Caribbean economies. And when we talk about narrow range of exports, we talk about dependence on a few markets. When we talk about high dependence on tourism, and then we talk about pre-existing levels of poverty, employment, engagement, especially youth employment. I mean, these problems have been there, and then came the pandemic, and we a quickening rate in terms of how these play out within the economies. And I'm going to ask one of the hard questions here, which is, I say hard for me because it's something that we grapple with. How do we embark upon fixing a region that has been battered by the pandemic, which has quickened the pace of what has been happening? How do we fix that against this backdrop of problems that we have already had and have been ongoing? Do you see evidence, are you optimistic that the pandemic, therefore, let me phrase it differently, has brought renewed interest, and I'm saying this to the entire panel in your different space, has it brought renewed interest in making the changes, or at least setting about to make those changes that are necessary in order to not just turn around the impact of the pandemic, but even beyond that, to dealing with the challenges that we've always faced, and that anytime that we have a shock within the region, you're going to have these negative manifestations. Are you seeing renewed interest? Are there good examples of countries that are embarking upon changes that are not just to brace the short term and to brace the fallout right now, but that are setting the stage for meaningful change within the economy beyond the pandemic? And I'm turning it over to the entire panel. Dindial, perhaps we can start with you since you're up here.
Okay, no problem. Firstly, what I will say is critical for, and you started with that point, the pandemic highlighted deficiencies. And if anything, at the first point of call, it brought to the fore issues that we couldn't gloss over anymore. And it showed how susceptible we are. So for one, it has raised awareness of where we need to make fixes. And I think that has been immediately highlighted over the last couple of years. If we look at actual initiatives that we could say were success stories, one is the digitalization drive, with remote working, with providing services in times of lockdowns. Digitalization and e-services got renewed attention. And I think this was a critical, if we want to call it silver lining coming out of the pandemic, that we could take forward. The diversification discussion, I think, has always been around. What the pandemic did was this worst case scenario that we speak about, it got us quite close to that, right? When you look at the fact that tourism numbers were, if not for months, below 100 persons, you were at the bedrock where we were speaking of how do we respond from. And out of that, we've seen economies adjust their tourism strategies, look for new growth poles. So I think it has turned it from more than a discussion to implementation. So we are seeing some of that. What needs to be done, though, is a holistic review of the regional context. And I think it started, there was talk of the CARICOM bubble when we were at the low of tourism numbers. I don't think the fact that tourism is returning means we should throw that to the back pages. The CARICOM bubble and the concept of regional integration needs to be there. Because if we look to this at our low point, this should be part of our artillery going forward. This should be that lowest common denominator we want to always have, right? So I think that was something that came up that we need to keep going with. Another aspect, not to take up all the time from Prof and Dr. Mooney, but another thing that I really want to stress on, during the pandemic, we were counting daily. At first, we were counting daily cases, daily deaths. Then we started to count the percent vaccinated. So it showed the use of statistics and data to inform decision-making. I think what I would want to know is that going forward, we maintain this focus on numbers to drive our policies, and that'll be critical. And of course, reducing dependence on foreign imported items, reducing dependence on items we don't produce, and reducing dependence on extra regional sources. So out of the 34th intersessional at CARICOM, we heard the focus on increased food security, and we have increased focus on Guyana's the food basket. So I think these are some things that, if not directly attributed to the crisis, it has come out of the crisis, we should take forward as we look at Agenda 2030. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Abdulkadri, any comments here?
Yes, I think Mr. Ramrattan mentioned all of it already. Yeah, just to emphasize one or two things. And I'll start from the issue of the importance of statistics. COVID-19 has really highlighted the importance of data and statistics. And while I cannot pinpoint that, a particular country is the best, an example of the best practice, but across the board, there has been a better appreciation of data. And what that does is to open up the discussion about how to make these more institutionalized. And you see that in Dr. Mooney's presentation and also in India's presentation. They were able to report on data, more current data. So whenever we talk about data, economic data, financial data in the Caribbean are not a problem, because these financial data, economic data are pretty much a requirement for one or more programs in international financial institutions. So countries, the central banks and the ministries of finance have invested interest in making sure that this data are available. Now, when it comes to social data and to a lesser extent, environmental data, that's where we have a huge gap. I mentioned the issue of poverty, but you don't see current poverty figures generally across the Caribbean. Is it that we don't measure poverty? Sometimes they are not measured, but even when they are measured, they are not reported, because maybe the government is not comfortable with the numbers, or maybe many other issues may result in those numbers not being widely disseminated. So we have to, employment data, it's another issue, where when you talk to people, you have a feel for the level of employment or lack of employment, but we don't have very current employment data in the Caribbean. So social data are not routinely processed and made available for use. So what COVID has done is to highlight the importance of having this kind of data for government to be able to provide adequate response and to provide, in the case of social protection policies, where the Caribbean governments have actually done a very good job with respect to that in providing salary relief and a number of short-term measures. But going forward, how do we institutionalize this so that you don't need a crisis to trigger that? There will be administrative record that will ensure that those things are routinely processed, and all you need to do is to report that you've lost your job or something happened that will allow you to be eligible for those kind of the different forms of assistance. Then the issue of regional integration, that also COVID-19 has highlighted the need for that, the food security, where because of emergencies in which things, the normal systems no longer work, then you now have to rely on what you have or those things that you could rely on with respect to the supply of food or essential materials. And in transportation, interregional transportation, where we see the collapse of has really made transportation within the Eastern Caribbean countries or to the Eastern Caribbean countries a challenge. So these are some of the issues that COVID-19 has highlighted and provides an opportunity for a better dialogue, because now we see the importance of those things that we had and we did not value as much, or things that we did not have, and then we see that they are actually really needed in cases of emergencies like this. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you. Dr. Mooney, any thoughts? I mean, we've been dealing, the issue of tourism is simply nothing new. Renewed efforts, considerations in terms of how we navigate forward, not just in terms of bracing these economies, but how can we help? Measures that you all may be contemplating, or that you can advise based on your experiences in all different parts of the world, in terms of how we change this, that dependence, or we make that dependence more efficient. It results in greater benefit longer term to those countries.
I mean, really good questions, and ones that we have been thinking about even before the crisis. I mean, let me say a couple of things. Specifically to the tourism sector, again, this is a crisis like any other. It's an extreme outlier. You know, hopefully we don't see something like this again in our lifetimes. We've never seen it before, at least specifically with the tourism sector. So I think it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? I mean, as I said before, you know, our countries in the Caribbean are blessed. You know, when you look at that tourism dependency index that we came up, you could look at it as a vulnerability index, but you can also look at it as an opportunity index. These little countries are, you know, offering services consumed by a very large proportion of the world, and it generates a lot of demand and a lot of foreign exchange. I think the first thing to think about is ways to optimize that, right? I mean, I think until now, and you can see its reflection in one of those things I mentioned, which was, you know, the fact that it wasn't a major shock to the balance of payments in many of the countries reflects the fact that actually, even though the tourism dollars are coming in, there's also a lot of imports that are being brought in to support that tourism sector, right? I think one thing that can be done, and it's important, it has been highlighted, is that if you can do a better job through integration of the Caribbean region itself, of providing some of those inputs that you're importing, things like food. I mean, anything, you know, the Caribbean countries could be the breadbasket, not just of the region, but of the world, right? I mean, there's investment from China and other countries in agricultural land and capacity in this region for a good reason, because it's extremely productive. So I think there's lots of opportunities to increase the value added in local production content of the existing tourism sector, which I think could have a tremendous positive benefit for the economies in the region in normal times, right? So I think there's lots of lessons like that we are seeing in this crisis that I think need to be pursued. More generally, as I said before, I think this is a real opportunity to think about what we've learned, and the virtualization of almost every industry, I think, presents, as I mentioned before, a huge opportunity for countries in this region that again have natural advantages. I will refer you, it's the thing I didn't present, but to our most recent regional flagship publication, which focused on digital transformation. Right, we did some estimates of for example, of infrastructure gaps in digital telecommunications in that sector between our countries specifically and advanced economies of the OECD. And what we found was that the gaps are big. The investment requirements, both public and private, are pretty big, but that the potential returns on those investments are huge, right? I mean, order of magnitude larger return of investment if you were able to make those investments in terms of productivity growth, employment, and GDP. So I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, right? I mean, we're not talking about extraordinary sums of money. It's just a matter of making sure you're targeting that investment properly, you're getting the kind of buy-in from the private sector you need and partnering with public sector, and that you're developing the skills around that allow you to take advantage of it. So I think that there's a lot of these kinds of lessons that are being underscored by this crisis, that if we can focus on those in the next 5 to 10 years, there is potential to move the needle for growth in the Caribbean. I'll say one last thing. The other thing we are seeing, right? I mean, at this point, most countries are further behind now than they were before the crisis. I mean, that goes without saying. As I mentioned, investment has been lagging in our region. Public investment and private investment, infrastructure is lagging. This is one of the reasons for low productivity growth. I think that making sure that the macro fiscal picture is supportive of higher levels of investment going forward is going to be very important. There are lessons here, for example, Jamaica, that did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of institutional reform, fiscal and monetary before the crisis. They came into the crisis with big fiscal buffers, and they're exiting with not much worse. In fact, they're already better than they were going into the crisis in terms of public debt levels, fiscal sustainability metrics. It's an example of countries that if you do the institutional reform that you should do in terms of fiscal management, you can make yourself resilient and actually get yourself back to, make yourself much more resilient to this kind of shock in the future. So I would focus on those things as lessons from this crisis.
Dr. Mooney, as I have you here, we have a couple of questions here aimed at you and the IDB. And the question from the audience of IDB in late 2020 mentioned that there are concrete nearshoring opportunities for Latin American Caribbean region. What are the top 3 strategic initiatives that Caribbean economies should undertake in order to benefit more from these opportunities in a post-pandemic world? And I know you made some mention of it already.
Yeah, that's a big question. Yes, so I mean, one of the new strategic priorities of our institution is to focus on things like nearshoring, right? And for those who don't understand what that means or don't know, aren't familiar, nearshoring is really the idea of, for example, the United States offshoring of production, manufacturing to lower cost jurisdictions like Mexico, like China, in particular China, other places around the world, production and operations that used to be undertaken in the United States, that has been going on for 30, 40, 50 years, right? And benefited tremendously countries like China that now have very large current account surpluses with the United States and the rest of the world. So the idea is countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region should be able to do the same thing and take advantage of being closer to these big markets like the United States and Canada and internally and make themselves available for that. I think there's lots of ways to drive that agenda. One of them is what I mentioned: skills, technology, making yourself available to provide those services in a way that perhaps you're not able to now. That's important. Skills, I think, are at the end of the day one of the most important pillars there. I think regional integration and making sure that these small economies individually, if you were able to integrate more in the way that has been envisioned for many years, you can create the kinds of economies of scale in terms of consumption, but also scale in terms of production, and being able to find the different inputs that are required for global supply chains. I think that those are the kinds of solutions. Those are the kinds of measures that you can help yourself with in terms of positioning yourself for getting more of a bigger slice of the global demand pie, certainly in terms of manufacturing and now services.
Okay, thank you. We've been talking about, again, the nature of the pandemic, how in terms of economic and social life, we focus a lot on the tourism aspect. Let me switch a little bit from the focus on the tourism to talking about the countries that are commodity dependent, and that represents the other spectrum of Caribbean countries outside of the tourism dependent countries. And the question is coming from the audience. If we're a country that is heavily reliant on hydrocarbons and not much else, checks and regulations that cause the closure of countless small, medium enterprises and jobs in every industry beyond just tourism, but food and beverage, entertainment, clothing, etc. What types of fiscal and monetary measures, and any measures, economic measures in general, what could be realistically put in place to stimulate growth and success of the small and medium enterprise going forward? Any members of the panel want to? And I know this is a difficult one. For commodity dependent countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, high dependence on energy. And yes, within Trinidad and Tobago, we've had a tremendous impact on small and medium enterprises. What can be done, or what initiatives might you all suggest? What can be done in terms of helping small and medium enterprises beyond some of the measures that you all have already been talking about?
Well, I'll probably go first. Well, in terms of it started with a question around fiscal and monetary policy. And I think we have to remember small island developing countries. First of all, we have certain limitations in our monetary policy. We import a lot of monetary policy based on our dependence to external markets. So what we need is supportive and harmonized policies that complement each other, whereby we do have the monetary policy that supports increased SME activity. We're talking about interest rates a lot here. I'm sure if we talk monetary policy, credit to the private sector. And the fiscal policy has also got to be tied in both an institutional and a financial component. We need to have that enabling environment that fosters the growth of the small and micro enterprise. And this is beyond this includes having regulations and policies, but it also looks at how do we help our SMEs to be sustainable and provide the necessary levels of support through fiscal incentives or opening on new markets. And we've seen a lot of this through import-export banks. We've seen a lot of this in terms of the access to foreign currency. I mean, you stated a country there that does have policies towards access to foreign currency for manufacturers to export. And then the closure of your question, I think what we have to focus on is when Arthur Lewis spoke about the need for surplus, when he spoke of that surplus labor theory and the need for industrialization around agriculture, we need to remember diversification doesn't mean dropping one industry for another. It's about creating this harmonious ecosystem where we have a few critical inputs. Jaron just reminded me that in Singapore, where tourism is about 1% of export revenues, we're talking about an economy of about 3% of export revenues. But that's realistically what we're talking about is 19 million tourists in 2019. So our economies don't attract that level, but you look at the level of diversification they have, that even with such a significantly sized tourism industry, you have other industries surviving. I think that is critical. But going back to the earlier point, what we need is a supportive architecture that brings small and micro enterprises, gives them access to credit, access to finance, It gives them the skills to build business proposals, to be able to produce export earning industries. So that's where we should probably be looking at. How do we support competitiveness through our activity?
Okay, thanks, Dindial. I wonder, one of the things that we have seen within certainly Trinidad and Tobago and the region here, Dr. Abdulkadri, you had a comment on that, or?
We can move on. Yeah, if the opportunity arises, I might make the comment at another.
Well, I'm glad that you came on next, because my next question is really is going to you, and we were going to talk about education. We're switching now, switching up a bit, talk about education, and we've seen many countries, and certainly here in Trinidad and Tobago, where things have, the way that education is done has changed. We've gone online. I mean, being the most significant change. And for many, that is a tremendous change in mindset, because education has always been this face-to-face contact. And here we had countries, and we had Trinidad and Tobago changing rapidly, almost overnight, implementing online systems. And it beckons a question, and the question is coming from the audience as well. Should we continue? How do we do? Is this something that we should institutionalize, or is it something? Is the education system in its current form sufficient? Have we learned some lessons from the pandemic that suggest that our education model may need to be changed, and if so, how? And institutionalize, as you have been emphasizing all along. How do we emphasize, institutionalize these changes? What changes should be institutionalized, and how do we make those? And again, the education issue is at the heart of the matter of many of the other issues that we talk about. We talk about entrepreneurship, small and medium enterprises, inequality, poverty. I mean, many of that has, within the economic literature, ties back to this issue of education. So what do you think, Abdulkadri? Is the education model something we need to rethink? If so, and how? And what can we learn and implement moving forward?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Deonanan, and the participant who asked that question. Just before I touch on that, let me just make a quick addition to what Dindial mentioned with respect to the issue of the SMEs. The Caribbean in general has a challenge in the sense that the sub-region is highly indebted, where you have public debt at a unsustainably high level for quite a number of the Caribbean countries. What that does is inhibit your ability to use some of these fiscal policies to implement or to drive the kind of activities that you would like to see. For example, economic theory would suggest that you have, counter-cyclical expenditure. In times of boom, the government holds back. In times of recession, the government boosts the economy. But if during the time of the good times, we are accumulating debt, then what happens during the time of recession when we are supposed to be spending? Now, typically what happens is that the government cuts back. And I'm glad Dr. Mooney mentioned the case of the reform that Jamaica did. Jamaica went through a very tough time, but through that, they learned a very good lesson, which in this case is a very good, good example for the rest of the region to take note of. And when you look at the expenditure pattern, what you see is that the capital formation, expenditure on capital formation is generally low. And how do you drive innovation? How do you drive growth when expenditure on capital formation is low? So these are some of the issues that the governments of the region need to pay attention to, not only in terms of the small and medium size enterprises, but in general, in order to boost growth. And with the case of the SMEs, and in addition to some of the issues that suggestions that India made, we need to focus especially on the issue of making finances, making loans accessible to these enterprises, because the condition under which they have to get finance generally do not promote investment. Many of them will have to rely on their own personal savings or investment from family members and friends. In the case coming out of COVID-19, there has to be a way to boost that their reinvigoration of the economy through the SMEs. So I just wanted to add that. Now, specific to the question you asked, I think the education system in the region needs reform. Some countries are already addressing that, and COVID-19 will only accelerate that. Because what we have seen, and when I was on campus, there used to be this debate where some of my senior colleagues will say, at some time will become irrelevant, because if somebody could download a course outline from Harvard, which may be out of public instances made available, then what would be our relevance in terms of those who are teaching? And COVID-19 actually highlighted that, where even in traditional setup, in elementary schools, primary schools, and secondary schools, where some students have had to learn only by reading handouts or reading those whatever their teachers posted on their platform. There is already change happening, which now task those who are in the education sector to add value to what is being done. Because what you notice generally is that the education system tend to promote people to accommodate persons who are learning to pass, not necessarily to acquire skills and education. So if you are able to pass, if you can not attend class for a greater portion of the semester or the term, and you still end up having A, then the question arises as to whether the person must be very brilliant, or the system is not challenging them enough because they know the trick. All they need to do is that maybe they know what the teacher will ask, and a week to the exam, they just go and study that and they pass. But when they get to the world of work, that's where they really, those deficiencies show, where you have a student with, excellent record, but cannot perform simple tasks, because all his or her life, what they've been doing is to study to pass, not necessarily to gain that knowledge. So there has to be a reform in which that skill acquisition has to take place. A few years ago, we were having a meeting at ECLAC, one of our expert group meeting, and I think I recall it was we were talking about the issue of high unemployment, and the chairperson of Export TT was in attendance at that meeting, and she said, this baffles her, because every time they have companies, international investors, asking them that they can't find the kind of persons they want to hire. They're willing to hire, but they can't find people to hire. It's not because there are no people looking for work, but they don't have the kind of skills that they want. But we keep, producing graduates, producing secondary school leavers who are not necessarily competent. They may have the qualification on paper, but they don't have the skills to match with the qualification. And if you have an education system that produces such output, then there has to be, it's only logical to question whether what is being done is being done right. So COVID-19 shows that you really may not need to have a teacher in class to deliver the curriculum. So what would be the value adding of that teacher? If somebody could develop a course, put it online for all secondary school in Trinidad to do math online. All right. So the value adding of the instructor, of the teacher, will be that skill which they are able to impart in the student, and to also serve as that, for lack of a better word, role model which we now navigate them through the school, what they have been learning in school, and the application, the applicability of those, the education that they are receiving in the world of work. And in my own experience as well, I've sat on many panel interviewing people for work, and they come with very glowing credentials. And I get disappointed, with the interviews, because you come away with not a very comfortable feeling that, this poor person do not know that they don't know, because the education system gave them a certification that, you're a first-class product. You had all A's in your cape, or ones in your cape. So when they are now confronted in the workplace about simple tasks and they can't perform, then they don't believe it, because all their lives they've been made to believe that they have superior skills, or that they get destroyed because of that, because now they realize that what they have, that they think they have, really do not carry weight. And so it's a touchy issue which I'm passionate about, but the short answer to that question is that there is need for reform. How do we do the reform, and what will involve? It will involve a lot. But the key issue is that we have to make sure that the products that we are generating not only have this certificate that they are being given, but they have the skills and competencies that measure up to those qualifications that they have been awarded. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulkadri. We are nearing the end of our session here, and these are certainly some tremendous insights from all of you all, and we are certainly grateful. But I am forced, not because of one, but because of time, to consider our last comments now. And let me throw one last question here for you to comment, to provide your insights on, and to perhaps make any closing statements. And the last question here really concerns the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war. And do you all see, we've been talking about the pandemic exacerbating underlying conditions. Do you all see any potential impacts coming beyond just the pandemic, but coming from the Ukraine-Russia war on the region, and any insights in terms of how that might play out? If so. So closing comments, as well as what do you see as the impacts potentially on top of what we have already been experiencing? Dr. Abdulkadri, maybe we can start with you since you're on.
Yes, I'll quickly touch on that. And I'll start with tourism or foreign direct investment in the Caribbean. And I think I know of this in Jamaica, possibly in other Caribbean countries as well, where you have investment, Russian investment in the tourism sector. So with sanctions coming out as a result of the war or the invasion, then you probably will see those investments being pulled back, or projects that have been committed to not actualized. So that's one area in which we have to focus on and look at what possible impact that might have. In tourism also, because you have people from Europe who come to the Caribbean, generally on vacation. So that might have an impact where you have, because of the travel restrictions and the fear of maybe falling under these the sanctions, being caught in the sanction trap, you may see some pullback in tourist visit from Russia and from Eastern Europe in general. The issue which we cannot not talk about is energy, which could actually play out in a positive sense if there's a sanction or broader sanction on Russian oil, or if Russia decides to hold back oil as their own retaliatory action, whichever way it plays out, then that provides an opportunity for the energy producing countries in the Caribbean to benefit from that, if they are able to increase their short-term supply. And this is where the issue of interregional trade also comes in, where if they're able to do that, they may be of help to kind of lessen the impact on the other Caribbean countries that are net energy importers. So I will leave just those 2 points, and I let my colleagues also contribute. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ramrattan, you want to take next?
Well, I think Professor Al-Kadri really spoke to it well there, so there's no need to belabor the points he made. What I will add, though, is let us not forget, we also have the perennial hurricane season. So when we start talking about crises and separation, I think that's where we may be losing a bit of the picture. We are highly vulnerable states. And whether it's the Russia-Ukraine impasse, whether it's the impending hurricane season, whether it was COVID or some other manifestation, I think what we need to think about going forward, and this is where Russia-Ukraine does give us some impetus to think about it, how do we make ourselves more resilient? So whichever crisis does come our way, what are the fixes that we need? So we need short-term adjustments, but we need long-term reforms. How do we address our dependence on foreign commodities? How do we address our vulnerabilities? How do we ensure we insulate ourselves in a manner in which we are not solely monocrop? These are the discussions we need to continue with. So I think I view Russia, Ukraine, and COVID and natural disasters as all one in the same bucket. Those shocks, whether geopolitical, whether extraterrestrial, or whether natural hazard, that we need to prepare for. And to do it, we need to do it by looking at our incomes, looking at our composition, ensuring we have the correct mix of short-term policy measures to support our revival while we strengthen ourselves in the long term to make ourselves resilient. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Mooney, your comments, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of the important issues were mentioned. I mean, for me, beyond the FDI and potential tourism, and if this causes a global demand contraction, that's going to have an impact on everyone. I mean, I think right now the unfortunate thing is its timing, right? I mean, the impact it's having on commodity prices, particularly hydrocarbons, for those countries that import these commodities, it's a horrible time. It adds to the issues we talked about in terms of inflationary pressure, pass through, and the complex policy environment for countries trying to recover. Obviously, the flip side is also partially true for commodity exporters. Sometimes it still shocks me, even though I know the numbers, when I look at Guyana's growth forecast, for example. This has pushed that up even higher. So, but I think really it's just unfortunate timing. For me, that's the most in terms of trying to calibrate policies for recovery in the face of this abnormal sort of supply chain inflation environment. This is just making that worse for many countries. So for me, that's the unfortunate thing. Let's hope it's not a lasting phenomenon. Let's hope it's something that dissipates. But we will see. I mean, in a broader sense beyond just our region, I was just saw from the institution I used to work for, the IMF, the now deputy managing director put out an article about how this is going to diminish the dollar's primacy as global reserve currency over time because of I think there's all kinds of factors and permutations of this crisis that we haven't gotten our heads around just yet. So let's see what happens. I think it's maybe hard to anticipate.
Yeah. Thank you. On behalf of the Department of Economics and certainly the committee, the Demas Rampersad Seminar Series Committee, we are grateful that you all have taken time out of your schedules to share these valuable insights. And I mean, these are tough questions, and one that we continue to work on within the region, within organizations like yours and us here within the Department of Economics. Thank you for taking your time. And I also need to thank the we've had quite a vigorous discussion These questions have been coming from the audience. We are grateful that you are here, and we are grateful for your questions. We continue to be your partner in terms of understanding the issues that are involved, economic and social, because these are intertwined. And we look forward to hosting other seminars on this issue and ongoing issues within the region. I'd like to bring the discussion, the panel to a close. And once again, thank you, everyone. Have a good one. Be safe.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Have a good day.
Thanks, Vic.